PowerPoint presentation for you, but I'll just stand to make it easier for me to go through it. So basically I'm talking about the halal certification industry, and it relates definitely to the discussion we had now, because I'm talking about like the kind of molecularization of halal involved in the certification process. And but specifically I'm looking at how this is produced, how it's debated, but also how it gets evaded in the process of certification. So I'm basically, the context is that the halal certification industry has grown almost exponentially in the last 2 decades, right? And part of that growth has been, besides finance and vacations and all these things, a lot of it has been related to food. And this is related both to meat and non-meat products. So now, for example, in the US, consumers at a kind of a grocery store can buy halal certified Australian lamb. Or pilgrims in Makkah, is this a problem? Oh, sorry. Or pilgrims, say, in Makkah, may be eating halal certified Brazilian chicken at Al-Baik Al-Baik fast food outlet. Another instance was, for example, a couple of years ago, where South African Muslims were alarmed to note that on the national airline, they now were being served halal certified bottled water and also halal certified individually wrapped toothpicks. So, I mean, I'm trying to, the point of focusing on certification is that the certification industry has facilitated these types of consumption in new scenarios, new places, but also on new products. And so what you had is that across the globe, ulama and business leaders have come together to create these organizations that facilitate this global trade, but also facilitate the consumption of halal in new contexts. The goal of certification is basically to create kind of global standards under these kind of organizations like the World Halal Council or the World Halal Food Council. So the standards that these organizations create at both the global and the local level aim to basically assure consumers that there can be some certainty about halal regardless of the place or the product being consumed. And importantly also the place of origin of the product. And the aim, I suggest, is that actually it seeks to overcome the trust that once was in the local butcher or the local the local store. However, what you have is, so you have this kind of goal of standardization and an increasing appeal to standardization, but at the same time you have various organizations competing in the same market. And so different organizations can have different rulings on what constitutes halal. So historically we know that there are variants of halal, both between madhahib but also regionally across places. It seems that the aims of standardization actually, even though through this appeal to standardization, it comes into conflict with the various locally specific interpretations of these practices. And so my paper, what I tried to do is address these variances and these issues of conflict. I want to suggest also that the interest of the halal certification industry necessitates a move towards more stringent interpretations to support a kind of a reification of halal. But in doing that, again, but the diversity continues. And I think that even when particular interpretations are taken, people may adopt them for some time and then move back. So the issues that I focus on are food technology and cross-contamination. I take these case studies from my research in South Africa, but I think that they are quite instructive for understanding a lot of these debates circulate in various parts of the globe. So I think they're indicative of the general terrain of this kind of molecularization. So I want to begin just by introducing you to the question of food technology and then the issue of cross-contamination as it developed before quickly going into these case studies. Okay, so food technology basically entails the extension of halal beyond meat products. So now you have that enzymes, colorants, or additives in the food manufacturing process may be of animal origin or they may contain alcohol. These are the two main issues. So all of a sudden what you've had is you've had the extension of halal considerations into previously innocuous products. For example, the example of toothpicks. So when I was doing this research, the argument by the certification industry has been that the toothpicks may be flavored with a particular alcohol solvent, and you need to make sure that that alcohol that's used is not of the impermissible type. Importantly, given that these concerns are now invisible and not accessible to the ordinary person, it necessitates this kind of expert mediation. And I've also tried to say elsewhere that this mediation, it's a self-producing mechanism, and an important part of that has a move to this expertise has been driven by the industry itself. But of course, we also know that people nowadays in the increasingly technological world with cell phone apps and all types of technology, Muslims themselves may question, so it's not necessarily so instrumental, but it's an important part of this extension of halal into non-meat products. So that's with food technology. Now the issue of cross-contamination is a term that the industry has given to the potential that halal and non-halal can come into physical contact with each other. And this can apparently, according to the way they speak about it, happen at any point between production and consumption. So of course the presence of halal lamb chops from Australia being sold in Chicago clearly, created this problem for the certification industry. And so what they did was they created these procedures where you need to now have separate cutlery, crockery, and utensils, but also transport vehicles, kitchens, and probably shipping containers and these kind of things. So what the halal industry does is they stipulate the separation, and then they develop auditing procedures at various points to ensure that this kind of separation is being upheld. So a result of something like cross-contamination is that in South Africa, through my research, I found that people who are very comfortable, say, having a toasted cheese sandwich at the local fast food outlet, and avoiding the bacon and the burgers and all these things, suddenly began to wonder in the last 2 decades, what's happening in the kitchen? Is it the same pan? Should I be doing this? And I think that this is a result of cross-contamination in the consumer side, but it's also been obviously key for production and trade. So suddenly familiar places became off limits. Also, cross-contamination is almost like it facilitates. We'll get to the example, but it's kind of a concept which according to the industry, people need to be aware of so that they can imagine or envisage where a potential risk could occur. So it's no longer based on something that's observable. It's now something that you're supposed to envision into an unknown world. So contamination can be proven, if it happens, through things like DNA tests or kinds of sampling. So what happens through food technology and cross-contamination is that halal decisions, which were based on place, where this consumption is happening, personal relationship, who is it happening with, and also, importantly, the physical nature and the appearance of the product. Meat versus non-meat, of course, but also in complicated scenarios, the possibility to use the senses to apprehend what the nature of this, so the material form, has been replaced now by a kind of invisible molecular determination. Sorry, I hope I didn't over. Okay, so so that's generally kind of an overview. I want to just quickly introduce the South African context to give you a sense of, you have these broad kind of moves towards standardization, but of course we know that the organizations that do this work are supported by ulama, and they are tasked with consulting with scientists to produce fatawa on specific products. But the thing is, these ulama all have different backgrounds, they come from different regions, and they follow different madhabs, so they often have to, basically navigate their way through this terrain. And of course, given the differences in Muslim organizations, nobody really wants to accept standardization as much as the industry is demanding it. Okay, so with food technology, I want to discuss two issues. As I said, it's the food technology. I want to discuss the issue of gelatin as it occurred between the different organizations in South Africa, and then a controversy about cross-contamination and how a particular organization that was basically central to developing certification in South Africa then later came up with a way to avoid it. Maybe I can just introduce to you the terrain. So in South Africa, we now have 4 Halal certification organizations. The first one is very old. It started in 1958. But back then, it was basically the butchers, the Muslim butchers had their own association, and they felt that they needed to approach the ulama just to make sure that they could have somebody there to make sure everything was fine. So everything was basically, it was all about meat, and it was basically about being a member of the Butchers Association, which gave you a certificate. And so it wasn't really certification, but they claimed that this was the start of certification. The thing is that this carries on for about 30 years, but importantly, it's only in about 1984 when this first organization, the Muslim Judicial Council, the MJC, there's a split in the MJC. They split with the butchers, but also they split between themselves. And the key issue that comes up around this time is the discovery that margarine, which people had been using at least for the last couple of years, contains gelatin. So this presented a new problem, and there were all these investigations, but it also presented the first kind of awareness that actually halal certification could go beyond just meat. So that was the first issue they had with each other. But the other issue was that around the same time, the ulama were starting to say, you know what, now that our meat is halal, we can just sell it in the national chain store. And the Muslim butchers were like, no, they didn't want to do it. So you had a split in the ulama organization, and the butchers left the MJC to create another organization called ICSA. But I won't really be discussing ICSA. So the main issue is the MJC, the oldest running organization, which continues to be a major player in the industry. So this is happening around 1984. 1995, and this also occurs together with the kind of liberalization of the South African economy. You have, again, in another area of South Africa, you have a group of butchers, business people from the Indian trader communities that come together with their ulama organizations, mainly from Barelvi and Deobandis, to establish a kind of a national halal authority. So their aim is to basically create a national authority. And I guess the main differences between the 1995 organization of Sanha and the MJC is that the original organization was predominantly a Shafi organization, and later was the Hanafis. So a lot of these issues that come up happen as the certification industry expands, and you have more and more players, people taking different approaches. Okay, so the issue with gelatin was that gelatins, as the Muslims became aware of this problem of gelatin, it was suddenly there in a whole host of household items. Now, before the issue was raised, people used to eat like Jello. During the 70s, I've heard people say that it was like this novel item, it was this new thing, and so Muslims would happily consume it, and they knew it was gelatin, but I think they didn't really understand or conceptualize what this gelatin was and why it would be a problem. Gelatin is obviously used as a stabilizer in the food industry, It's a fairly recent development. I mean, household gelatin can be produced by basically a broth of bones. When boiled and reduced for a long time and then cooled, will create a jelly-like substance. But in the mid-18th century, you had the first patent in England for the use of gelatin in woodwork for adhesives. So this was since the 18th century, there's been the increasing development of gelatin as a separate product. So now you can buy gelatin as like crystals, and you can add a teaspoon or two to whatever food you're making. So at this time, when this issue arose, the MJC was approached, the MJC, the Halal organization, in 1984, undertook an investigation. So the issue was, at that point, they were the only certification organization, And the halal industry was quite small, so there were not actually that many halal slaughtered animals in South Africa. And they produced a very, it was 1983. So they produced a very famous fatwa, of which I'll just quickly try and summarize, which essentially they approved the consumption of gelatin from non-halal slaughtered animals. And the arguments which they presented was that there was a widespread use, a kind of, in English, common affliction. The Arabic is basically some kind of general occurrence. And they said that there was no viable alternative. But importantly, as a Shafi organization, they appealed to the idea of istihala, a metamorphosis. So they assessed that because gelatin went through an intensive chemical process of being processed through hydrogen chloride, extreme pressures and temperatures in order to get this crystal, that there was a change of an essence. And importantly, they ruled that there was a complete change of essence. It did not resemble the original state of the bones and the skins from which it came, but also that the process was irreversible. On top of that, there were no alternatives for deriving from halal animals, and it was so widespread and such a common issue that they ruled that this was okay, you could accept it. Interestingly, in their decision, in their ruling, in their fatwa, they even mention that the use of dogs or pigs is not a norm. So they seem even to not rule it out. They don't rule out the possible use of these, completely forbidden animals. But of course, in interviews with them, they denied that. So what happened since 1984 was that people were essentially, the Muslims in South Africa were consuming halal gelatin on this basis, because the halal certificate began to appear on the gelatin box. So I think what's interesting, the first thing that's interesting about this is that even though they ruled on the permissibility of gelatin, they still obtained the certification contract to certify the gelatin manufacturing plant. And when Muslims queried, like, what's happening here, they said, no, this is fine, and they disseminated this argument. So when you had as the industry developed, for example, another organization came and agreed with this. So these guys, the second organization was a Hanafi organization. So for them, istihala was definitely an acceptable principle, and they also got together with chemical food technologists, and they explained that basically collagen is in gelatin, collagen is soluble. No, collagen is not soluble, but gelatin is. So they appeal to solubility, and they also explained that hide contains collagen, but it's not translucent. So for them, they were starting to talk about collagen in terms of the chemical nature of the product, but they were still using kind of physical material properties of solubility, but also of translucence in accepting this position. So they also accepted it, the second organization. But then along came this third group, Sanha, who originally, also a Hanafi group, which I explained, but they originally agreed with istihala, but afterwards they changed their mind. And I think this was part of the reason why they were not willing to give me the actual the fatwa that they have produced on these details. And there was a lot of controversy about this change. Their argument was that gelatin is a form of collagen. Collagen is present in the skin and the hides before it was processed. So based on chemical continuity, it was not a process of metamorphosis or istihala, it was actually a process of extraction. So I think I'm suggesting that as Hanafis, they could not deny the principle of istihala, they didn't want to. But they had changed it to a molecular basis of extraction, and thereby introduced a completely new basis on which the nature of things is ascertained. It's no longer about observable form or the senses, smell, color, taste. One minute. Importantly, what Sanha did is that at the same time as they ruled on this extraction, they said that but we do accept the use of gelatin as long as you import from our factory in Pakistan, which is halal certified. So what happens at the same time as you have a molecularization, you also have a new condition where it's now, and I think in the last 20 years that has changed, especially in South Africa, but across the world, given the developments in transport. Now there's it's much more plausible for people to say, okay, we can transport food ingredients across the world. So I seem to have miscalculated, but but maybe I'll just take 1 minute to explain to you the issue of cross-contamination. So cross-contamination was interesting because it's derived from the food, health, and safety industry. According to the NSDA, the US Department of Health, it basically refers to when the harmful transfer of bacteria across food products. Specifically, raw materials shouldn't come into process with cooked food because raw materials, blood, and all these kind of uncooked items can have harmful bacteria. I think that the way the halal industry developed this idea of cross-contamination was actually a transfer of the idea of najis into halal. So you already have an idea that everything that is najis, all of the things that are najas are not halal. But on the other hand, all the things that are not halal are not necessarily najis. But what they do with cross-contamination is they conflate the two. So now everything that's not halal, whether it's a non-halal beefsteak, is necessarily also a contaminating substance and need to be kept apart. So I think that that was an important thing that I wanted to point to with cross-contamination, that it seems to be, I'm working with a kind of, with this contemporary work on situated ethics, is a kind of, like following someone like Wittgenstein, it's a kind of a way of where we make up the rules as we go along. Now, interestingly, what happened is, so there is no fatwa. There are no fatawa on cross-contamination. I mean, nobody has been willing to, able to share this with me. But the way that they speak about contamination is in terms of procedures. So they have these sets of procedures where they kind of rule on it. The controversy that took place was where the MJC decided to accept the certification of a halal in a cold storage environment where there were both pork but also non-halal meat and halal meat. So in this environment, so everything was there and it was in a freezer. What happened was that same company ended up printing fraudulent halal labels. So this thing exploded. The issue then came up, as this thing got exposed, why did you accept halal at this place? And the reason they gave was actually that you cannot have cross-contamination in a freezer environment because everything is frozen all along the way, whether it's in the ship or in the truck or in the place, it's always frozen, so therefore cross-contamination is not an issue. So in this case, I think that actually, and interestingly in this controversy, though all the organizations attacked the MJC, they attacked them for being unprofessional. And the question of cross-contamination didn't arise. And I think it didn't arise because of the nature of cross-contamination as a kind of a very recent, recent and novel articulation of halal. And if the MJC was given the public voice to explain their whole argument about the freezer environment, they would also kind of pull the bases out of the halal certification industry itself. Okay, so basically I'm just trying to say that we have standardization, but there's also a variety of difference. So, yeah, thank you.